to do a little intro for you guys to talk about just what's going on in the industry right now. How is accessibility? Why is it important? How are people trying to move this forward? That kind of thing. So that way we can all have a level setting field before we start going in and talking specifically about forms, which Eric will do a deep dive on. Can you move to the next slide, Eric? So I want to start with the good, because personally, I am a carrot person, not a stick person. So let's talk about why accessibility is a good thing to go after. Because normally when people talk about accessibility, they worry about the legal repercussions and the legal responsibilities they have. But there's a lot of benefits for using accessibility and championing accessibility within an organization. And there was a survey done by Accenture, and they found out that companies that actually put accessibility first within their organizations increased revenue by 28%, net incomes by 200%, and profit margins by 30%. So there's a financial benefit here to going after accessibility and making sure that all of your content is accessible both for your employees and for your customers. There's both sides of that accessibility story. So some of the other benefits are lower operational costs. I don't know if people know this, but it costs 42 times more to service a person in person than it does to do it online. But more so, there are cases where people have to come in person rather than do it online. And the example that comes to mind for me is the lawsuit with Domino's. There was a man who was trying to order a pizza and he couldn't do it either through the mobile app or through the website because of accessibility issues. So this is a prime example of not only did they have to cost more for this person to actually physically go to the retail location, to have the staff being there and having to have all those overhead costs, but they may have lost the customer entirely. He may have gone someplace else where he could order a pizza, because how many other places can he find a pizza? So considering one of the benefits, you have lower operational costs. Inclusive to your customers, you want to make sure that you're able to provide service to everyone. Again, if we go back to that Domino's example, you may have gone someplace else. I mean, I like a Domino's pizza, but there's also a Papa John's around the corner. So if it was in my case, I probably would have just switched. The market reach is also a very interesting one. I don't think people really understand how big of a target demographic this is. We're talking about a $1 trillion industry. There are people who have a market share of global spending power of over 1 trillion, not a B. I want to make sure you guys hear it. It's a T. So I think people underestimate how many people are there and what they can buy. But if we extend this to their friends and family, we can move that number from 1 trillion to 13 trillion. So it's really something that you don't want to overlook. Higher SEO ranking. Now, I know we all been working very hard to make sure our websites are getting the highest SEO ranking, but I don't know if people understand the minutia whenever we're talking about the details of actually pulling in your SEO ranking. When pages are close together, which a lot of them are now because we've all put a lot of effort into our SEO to make sure that we're getting higher scoring, Google Ads specifically say they look at accessibility when considering their SEO ranking. So you want to make sure you're also handling all of the accessibility requirements to get you guys a higher score so that you are showing up ahead of your competitors. Reputation and brand image. It's a really big thing now, especially with the younger generation. 70% of millennials strongly consider the moral standings of an organization before they purchase their product. And Gen Z is following the same trend. I don't have a specific metric for them, but they're also following behind the millennials, saying it's important what a brand stands behind. And innovation and creativity. When we start looking at things from different angles, it's surprising what we can do. And the boost on morale, to be able to sit through things and try to think through things differently. We can come up with all kinds of fantastic different solutions. So these are some of the good things. I like to start off on a positive note. Let's move along into the bad. Unfortunately, there is some bad news here. 35% of working adults have at least one disability. I was shocked when I heard that, but it does go back to the whole market share being over $1 trillion globally. 35% of working adults have at least one disability, and that number grows when we start looking at the aging demographic. So it's really something that we don't want to neglect. And because we were trying to do fair share and fair access, the governments globally have all gone ahead and started coming up with policies to ensure that everybody has fair share and can access their content. So depending on where you are in the world, I did see a lot of US, so we'll probably talk US stuff, but there's compliance regulations all over the world. In Ontario, where both Eric and I are from, we have the Accessibility for Ontarios with Disabilities Act. In Europe, they have the European Accessibility Act, and the one we're going to talk about mostly here today is the Americans with Disability Act. But the point I'm trying to get at is, as an entire world, we have realized that this is a problem, and we need to be making sure that we have access for people who have disabilities. And so this is the stick half of the carrot and the stick. There are legal repercussions if people don't follow these regulations. The most expensive one I could think of was the Target settlement of $6 million, which, I don't want to pay that. But here on the side, you can see I have some slides that are highlighting some other brands that also had to have some of these other stories. And if you're interested in any of these stories, you can do a quick Google search, or you can message me after this and we can go over these stories. I have all of the stories, so if you want to go through them. Some of them are really interesting, like the Harvard one. I'm going to take 2 seconds to talk about the Harvard one because I personally really like that story. Harvard and MIT, they decided to put a free course on their website, but unfortunately it wasn't accessible, so they got hit. So they were trying to do something good for the community. They put up a free course from Harvard, MIT, to go in and for people to use, and it wasn't accessible, and they had to deal with the legal repercussions of that. So you can move to the next slide, Eric. And unfortunately, it gets worse. 4,000 cases are filed each year. And this is looking at the ADA compliance, so this isn't looking at the United States. We're seeing over 4,000 every year. And this is all done by a small group of plaintiffs. That's the majority of it. And what we're seeing is that they know what they have to do to present to the judge to be able to prove an accessibility miss in the regulations. So they're just taking that and moving from one organization to another business and another business, which is good money for them, but it hurts the rest of us, right? So we need to get ahead of it and try to solve those problems. 97% of these accessibility claims are specifically aimed at websites. And one of the things that were kind of neglected over the years was actually the digital forms that were on it. A lot of what they were looking at were like the pop-ups and some of the navigation on the website. But now they're starting to move into more of the digital forms because they do fall under the web content, because it's digital content that exists within your website. And we are going to go into that in more detail. But I wanted to highlight here that it's predicted that these numbers and these case filings are going to go up by 300%. That's what they're assuming that the trend will be in the next few years. So we have to start doing something to try to get ahead of this, so that way we can solve it. So if you stay with us, hopefully you get some tips and tricks on how we can get ahead of it. Eric, can you go to the next slide? And I'm actually going to hand it all the way back over to you.
Thank you, Angelle. So now what I want to do is go through some of the ways that we evaluate the forms and some examples associated with it, and to highlight the things that you need to be looking for. So forms still remain critical for many of the processes that you're dealing with, particularly those requiring signatures, retention of document records. From what I saw of the registrations, many of you have these kinds of challenges. You're either in state and local governments, you're dealing in financial services, you're dealing in healthcare. All of these areas are still dealing with forms as a critical communication tool internally and externally. And I want to make this, it's important to understand, we're dealing with this internally and externally. This is not just a user-facing scenario. Some of the lawsuits that you're seeing, or some of the challenges that you're seeing, are associated with internal processes that are not made accessible, and that's a requirement in many, many circumstances. Unfortunately, forms have been neglected for years by many organizations. And what we consistently see when we go and do an assessment of an organization's forms are the forms are still designed, built, and delivered as if they were 20 or 30 years ago. They haven't changed. And there's a lot of justifications that are provided associated with that. Well, it's too costly. Some of my users, some of my customers, some of my citizens can't access them. There's a lot of work associated with it. Oh, this is mandated. It has to look this way. We can't change it. All of those kinds of things. The challenge here is that this results in poor customer experience. It is a massive level of effort inside your organizations to collect that data from those printed forms or scanned forms. Maybe you got them emailed in, maybe you didn't. And there's a lot of effort in maintenance associated with those, in keeping them up to date, in changing them on an ongoing basis. And over the years, we've learned a lot of ways of making this a better experience, but still convincing people in your organization that they should change the forms when in reality they're working, they're not broken. So why would I go and spend money? Well, accessibility is a critical focus, and we can use accessibility as a way to communicate to the organization that we can do better and that we should do better, or worse, we're mandated to do better. We're obligated to do better. And this lets us bring those forms into the modern era, into the modern age, and create a much better customer experience. When we talk about accessibility in forms, a lot of the accessibility focus and a lot of the focus in your organizations is going to be on two major areas. From a digital perspective, it's going to be on web pages. That's where everybody's focused on it. As Angel talked about, many of the examples are around web content, web interfaces, web pages, menus, ordering, courses, all of those kinds of things. Or they've been focused on physical aspects. If you have branches or offices, those need to be physically accessible, and the changes necessary there are very costly, so that's been a primary focus, and that's good. That's exactly where it should be. However, forms are part of the digital experience. While you may not view them so much that way, but you're putting them up on your website, people are downloading them, they're expecting a certain level of experience and a certain level of accessibility. Does it have to be as good as other parts of your site? No, it doesn't. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second. But part of the driver that's limiting these things is that your forms are still really flat. They're based on paper. We refer to it as the breaking out of the 8.5 by 11 borders associated with your page. Your form doesn't have to do that. The document you produce might need to be an 8.5 by 11 or an A4 sized piece of paper printed out and signed. Maybe, okay, just maybe. But what the user uses to enter that data, what the user uses on the website, does not have to mirror the document that is produced. And that shift in the way that you think about data capture and document generation is a really critical influence, because that allows us to increase accessibility, get way better on accessibility. So form digitization, the desire to get rid of the fillable PDFs or the flat paper documents and go to an online environment and do more with the data integration, with your application integration to build web applications, is driving a lot of this renewed emphasis and consideration. But the complete processes need to be accessible. You can't have part of it that is accessible and part of it that's not accessible. That just breaks the process all over. So you want to ensure, because forms are part of your process, that they're as accessible as they can be within the context of it. As Angel noted, in the US, the ADA results in litigation. The reason for that is because that is specifically in the legislation, that the recourse when your organization does not provide an accessible experience for your users or citizens or customers is they sue you. That is exactly what the legislation says. In other jurisdictions, as Angel mentioned, Ontario here, that's not the case. Here, it's fines. It's a series of increasing fines based on the number of instances of failure to be accessible. What's interesting about the Ontario case, which is mirrored in other jurisdictions, is that in the Ontario fines example, the physical failure is linked to the website failure. So if you've got a branch that isn't accessible and part of your website isn't accessible, that's 2 hits against you. Your fines have increased. And they do fines on a daily basis until the situation is remedied. Those can add up very, very quickly. But in the US, it's legislation. So there is an entire industry of lawyers built around finding these situations, finding failure to create accessible websites, accessible forms, and they will sue you, right? Now, the ADA has no measures for compliance, no statements of this constitutes accessible. So it is now a legal argument as to whether or not it was good enough. And I'm going to talk about how we deal with that in a second, right? It does vary by region, geography. It varies by your institutional organization. Government organizations, specifically those that deal with the US federal government, have a different set of regulations than ADA. It's Section 508. It's a different set of compliance associated with it. So you need to understand what is the actual regulations and the actual legislation that affects your organization in your jurisdiction and understand what those are. One of the agreed upon, even though it's not stated in ADA, but in other jurisdictions, Ontario, for example, it is explicitly stated, but this is considered to be the gold standard for conformance and compliance. And this is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It is a set of requirements that define exactly what constitutes an accessible digital experience. It's designed around any kind of web experience. And so it talks specifically about form-related objects, whether they be a label, a fillable text field, whether it's tooltips on a fillable text field, it's interactions with a web environment. Web applications, all of those are covered. It is very comprehensive. It is also a relatively easy read. And so if you're involved in accessibility compliance for your organization, if you're not already familiar with it, go through it and read it. It is extremely valuable. I'm going to give you some examples of it in a second. And it ensures that there is accessibility in all contexts for a digital experience. But what is also really important is that compliance with the WCAG guidelines represents a better user experience. It's just a better way of interacting with websites. And it's a better way of interacting with forms. So it's a really good guide for a good UI, a good user experience, and it gets you accessibility. Now, the way that it works is it's 4 guiding principles, guidelines, and a series of success criteria and conformance levels. And those are the critical factors here. And what the success criteria defines is that for this kind of an object, here is the way that you need to make it accessible. And the conformance levels, okay, A, AA, or AAA, define the level of conformance associated with it. The important factor here is that WCAG does not say this is what you have to do. What it says is, here are the guidelines and the criteria. What you need in your organization is a policy that says, this is the level that we will comply to. You do not have to be AAA. You do not. And AAA for a lot of things is really, really, really hard. Okay? For give you an example, this webinar that we are doing right now is not AAA accessible compliant. It is AA compliant, but not triple. Why is it not triple? Because there's not a little window down here of somebody doing American Sign Language associated with it. Now it's double because it's Teams, and you could turn on captioning. You could turn on a mechanism that gave you the words associated with it so that if you had difficulty hearing, you could read associated with it, right? It's also double because we're giving you a recording associated with it. And because Teams as an application is AA compliant in most of its environments. But it's not triple because there's no ASL right here, right? So you need to decide what is the compliance level that you're going to achieve. This is critical because when somebody sues you for non-compliance, you can go to the court and say, this is our compliance. We achieved that. And the court goes, yeah, you did. Okay. But if you don't have that, then whatever the person said you should have is what the court says, well, yeah, that's reasonable. You should have had that. Okay. But if I can say, no, I don't do that. Okay. I go for single or double or whatever it is. Let me give you some examples. So setting or providing screen reader text. And this is a very clear example in one of the areas that forms often miss. And it's that you need to be able to have the form as presented in a browser readable inside of screen readers, right? And you can get a screen reader. All of the browsers support screen reading capabilities right now. Many of them are form aware, and I'll talk about that when I show you some examples of it. But let me give you an example of a level A. Labels or instructions are provided when content requires user input. Yes, you need to have the context, the label associated with what the field is. And that needs to be near where the field is, right? So having a title and a stacked series of empty labels that don't give a clear indication of what the user is supposed to do, that's not accessible. This especially comes in case when you're talking about screen readers and you're tabbing from field to field to field, because often persons with disabilities will not use a mouse. They're not clicking around. They're using the keyboard to move around, right? The second one is a great example of double A. Headings and labels should describe the topic or purpose. Well, that makes perfect sense. That's a better user experience. If you go to a website and you've got a heading in there that just doesn't mean anything, you don't know what you're looking at associated with. Now, you can figure it out in context, but a screen reader can't. So a screen reader is reading the actual text from the HTML underneath it. But let's think about this in a form context. Think about forms in your organization right now, forms that are on your website that users can download. Do you have any forms on your website that users can download now or fill out inside of the browser as a fillable PDF that have section A or section B? Well, that's not AA compliant in the PDF alone. The PDF, that's a horrible experience. Okay, that's a 30-year-old experience. Today, if you came to us and said, I want to design this form and it needs to have this information on it, we would put proper section breaks with proper descriptions on it just to ensure that the form got filled out correctly. Never mind accessibility, that's just proper form design. And yet we see so many old forms that don't do that, and therefore they're a struggle for ADA or any accessibility compliance. Okay, the sections, tabs with next and back. Tabbing order is one of the areas that fillable PDF forms fail miserably on, because if you just go into Acrobat Professional, or even if you're using a professional design tool such as Adobe Designer, and you're laying out a form with fillable fields, and that's good, that's a better experience, but the tab order that it'll put in is whatever you dragged the fields on, or the order you put the fields on. It might not be the proper order, and it might not handle the back properly associated with it. So you want to ensure, just to get minimal level A compliance, that the tab order actually makes sense and that it doesn't jump all over the place as you go through it. And you've experienced that. You've gone into forms, I know you have. Oh, I have to do it as a fillable PDF. Okay, it opened up in a browser. I hit tab. Why did it go down over there? Or I'm filling out an address. Why did it suddenly jump into the other column, as opposed to going down into the city and then the state and then the country and then the zip postal code, those kinds of things. validations and error messages. And you can see an example of single A and double A. If an error is detected, then the item is identified and the text, the error is described to the user in text. It's not just read, but that a message appears associated with it. All right. Now, in a fillable PDF, that's actually possible, but it's a little bit more complicated. But in an online form, that's an essential. We need to do that. And you can see the different levels. So the key message here is reviewing WCAG, reviewing the compliance levels, and creating a policy that covers all of your forms, whether they are flat, fillable PDF, or online forms, with a comprehensive description of what your conformance levels are going to be, and then meeting those conformance levels. Before I move into the demonstration of the examples that I want to show you, I just want to give you the special offer that Angel talked about. What we are willing to do is to give you 1 hour of one-on-one to help you understand how WCAG might apply to your situation, understand where you are right now, help you define what the next steps are for you, and help start a process so that you can understand what you should be doing, what you need to do to take your forms, to make them accessible, but also to create a better user experience and to reduce your overall maintenance costs. With that, let me move into some examples here. So the first example I'm going to show is, you can see, okay, that's a reasonably good looking form. A couple of things I want to point out. Remember I mentioned those sections? Well, here you see section titles, proper descriptions of section titles. Okay, and the fields are relatively obvious as to what you should be filling out, but here's a problem. And you can't tell from just this image, but that is an image. And you've seen that. Somebody took an image of an old printed form, scanned it, made it a PDF, and posted it on the website. A screen reader goes, image1.png. That's all it's got. It can't read it. Oh, well, the screen readers can do OCR. Yes, but now you're forcing that to do it. And when it does OCR, it's going to do the whole thing. There's no fields, there's no tabs, that doesn't help anybody fill this out. What you're basically saying with this is this should be print only. And that actually is a viable strategy to address equitability, persons who cannot access computers, who do not have availability of getting to the web to download the things properly. Friends can download it and you want a printed copy. Okay, fine. Put that in a separate location. We can make that a separate area so that we're not confusing people between digital content and print content. Now, from an accessibility perspective, is there a Braille version of this? Okay. There's been a lot of examples of where do you have Braille menus in restaurants? Okay. Do you need Braille? Now, you don't necessarily need it. Again, if you have a compliance document that says we are not doing that, this is what we are providing, this is the way that we are expecting it to work, then you should be all right associated with it. But the other problem with this is somebody took an image and converted it to a PDF. It's a horrible experience on mobile. Never mind not accessible. It's a horrible experience. Okay. If you are deliberately intending the person to download this, print it, and fill it out by hand, and that's fine, then you want to identify it that way. You want to make it clear that way, because that then makes it clear what the intent of this is, and there's no confusion. Oh, this should be a fillable version. Now, here's that same form. Well, what we did was we made it fillable. We added in fillable fields. Okay, this is better. It can be filled out in a browser, but we did it using Adobe Acrobat Professional. That means there's no tooltips, there's no help text, there's no error checking, there's no validation. The visual hints, and the birth date is the perfect example, are separated from that. So even if the screen reader could read this correctly, it's going to read birth date when you click on that, that field. It's not going to give you the hint. The hint is only for visual. All right, so that's non-compliant to the appropriate levels of conformance. Again, if you've established that you're not giving hints and you're not doing tooltips, okay, then that's fine. but those are minimum requirements in many cases. This is still a really bad experience because this is a PDF documented on mobile. This is a challenge for individuals. They're doing what we call the pinch and zoom. You have to pinch in, zoom out, get to the field, click on it, get the thing. It's just not a good experience. All right. And it's not accessible. All right. In a lot of these cases, depending on how you made those fields, which tool you used and how that was generated, screen reader might deal with this as a Word document and read everything to you all at once, not each individual field. It may not recognize that the label to the left is the label for that field. Depends on how it was created. So this is the kind of situation where we want to review these in detail and align with what you want from the conformance. Now, that's the bad, but here's the good. Here's that same form, but it's a fully browser-based user experience. It works on all mobile devices. It's what we refer to as reactive, in that as you scale the size of the window, even in a browser window, this scales associated with it. It helps the user through the filling process. Screen readers work exactly as expected. If you click in or you tab into a field, it reads the label off the field. Better, it reads the text that you told the screen reader to read. That's key, because you may wish, instead of name, you may wish to read to them, okay, please enter your whole name, first and last, okay, as the prompt associated with it. Those little icons you see on the right-hand side of each of the fields allow somebody to click on it or tab to it and press space to get a tip to show up. It provides validations and error checking all the way through, so that if you make an error, then it informs you at that instant in time so that the user can stop and correct the error. In cases of things like birth date, it pops up a date picker so that you don't get other data in there, so that we're ensuring we'll get better data. That's a better thing. Now, everything I've just listed there improves and meets accessibility requirements and accessibility guidelines. But all of that is also a way better user experience than just handing somebody a PDF and saying, here, off you go. And this still produces the regulatory mandated PDF document ready for digital signature if you want to do that, or ready for physical signature if you do that, or maybe you don't need it. Maybe the document now is just a reference copy you email to the user. This gives you all of those. And this sets the stage for you to do data integration, core application integration, pre-fill. You've logged into a portal, you're filling out this, I know who you are, I'll fill out your name and address for you. So it's all of those kinds of things. This is not only compliant, but just a better, more modern user experience that is what your users, your citizens, your constituents are expecting from you. Some of the other things that are important to hit on is there are many, many different testing tools. I've listed some here, but you should be using them. If you don't know what testing tool to use, go to your web content management team, your website team, and find out what tool they're using. If they're not using a tool, a checker such as Andy, if they're not using that, they should be. These are critical tools because it is very, very complicated to go through and identify all the gaps associated with it. And a tool like the Andy tool will go through and highlight contrast levels. This field doesn't have help text. This is a section name and we don't know what it means. So they're very, very powerful associated with that. And they provide a compliance report that you can then use to understand what corrections that you should do. And they work on forms, as long as they're online web forms. For PDF forms, there is the PDF Accessibility Checker. This is a tool, again, a free tool that you can download. There is also capabilities inside of Adobe Acrobat Professional to check the PDF. We encourage that you run your PDFs through it. That gives you information that you don't have checkers on this. Your tab order is completely broken. This doesn't comply. This doesn't comply. So those are great tools. Now, there's a lot of different tools out there. These are just some of the examples. These are not necessarily the best for your organization. As I said, specifically on the web content, you should be talking to your website team, and they should absolutely have one. So how do you go about fixing this? Okay, as I've said before and repeated, is establish a standard for your organization. There is no global one-size-fits-all standard. Okay, as a general rule, most organizations are targeting AA compliance across all of the success criteria as described in WCAG 2.1, which is the most current standard. Okay, that is a good target. You do not have to achieve AA compliance on all elements of that to be considered compliant. There is no magic rule. There is no global standard. ADA says nothing about this at all. Okay. We'll give you the Ontario example because it's fresh in my mind. Is in that case, it references WCAG directly. It references that you should attempt for AA in all areas, and where not possible, highlight, okay, the reasons why is not possible associated with it. Okay, it strongly encourages AAA, but does not in any way mandate it. And there have been multiple circumstances where fines have not been levied for AA or for single A compliance associated with it. So you have a standard, that's what you need to meet. Okay, you need to look at that standard. You may have one already for your web content from a website perspective. Use that as a starting point, but make it specific for forms. They may never have thought about fillable fields and drop-down menus and tab order and all of those kinds of things. You need to think about those for forms. So go through and add to that, extend it. Create a roadmap. Okay, changing all of your forms, especially if, as we suggest, you should be looking at moving them online, making a better user experience, shifting from your PDF documents into a modern environment. You can't do this all at once. So understand what your forms, understand the use cases, understand what format is needed. No, this particular form needs to be in a physical format because many of the folks that need to use this do not have access to a computer. They need to be able to come into the office to get it. One organization, we suggested what they do is that the person phones in, asks for the form, a service person at that organization would then open it up in their environment, pull data from the live systems to pre-populate it on behalf, print that copy so that they could give that to the person when they came in and provided appropriate ID, etc. But now it's pre-filled. Now we're helping them. That is a paper document with a good user experience, and it's as accessible as we can make it in those contexts, right? Understand your infrastructure and any system changes that are needed associated with it, right? As you shift into this kind of a model, what else is going to have to require? Don't forget organizational changes. You might need organizational changes internally to teach new people that process for downloading and printing and sending, all of those kinds of things. Then plan out future phases and enhancements. The last thing I want to leave you with is a way of thinking about the complexity of your forms. And this is a model that we use whether we're migrating and converting PDF forms to online forms, or whether we're talking about accessibility and identifying where we should be focusing our efforts and what the roadmap looks like. And a lot of people will talk about the complexity of their forms as a flat, straight continuum of 1 to 5 in terms of complexity. And that really doesn't capture a lot of the issues associated with form, because forms are part of an organizational process. They are part of a workflow. They are part of a business process. They have data implications. They have records management implications. They have accessibility implications. We use this model where form complexity, the number of fields on it and how complex and interactive those fields are, is across the bottom. And up the left-hand side is the integration, the number of workflow, the number of steps associated with it, the number of other applications, data, all of those kinds of pieces. And by looking at it in this model, especially when you're talking about accessibility and deciding which ones am I going to go after first, a lot of cases, organizations will say, oh, I'll take this complex one. Everybody uses this. If we get this, yes, that's good. And if everybody uses it, then there's a big value associated with it, but it will also take longer to do. And you may need quick wins. It may be better to take a series of basic, simple PDFs, all right, that right now are only lightly fillable, make them better, make them accessible, demonstrate the value associated with it, demonstrate the experience, and roadmap out the more complex processes associated with it. That's one of the recommendations that we make. And this is the kind of thing that we talk through on that one-on-one that we're offering to you. We'll work through with you how you can apply this, and you take this, please, okay, and adapt this to where it fits for your forms and for the different situations that you're in and how you want to tackle accessibility. And you can choose. This is the most complex one. Yes, it's going to take us a more time to do this single one, but if we do this single one right, the value to the organization is substantial. Okay, then good, do that. What we want is those decisions made with the full light of all the information that we have. And with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. Angèle, if you've got any questions from folks, I'd be happy to address them or answer them.
Yeah, I have some pre-submitted questions, but I want to encourage everybody who's on the webinar right now to ask your questions. We want to make sure that you're getting the most out of this, and I know Eric threw a lot of information at us, so hopefully you guys were really engaged and you were too busy to write questions, but do please take the time to write questions. You have Eric here, so he's able to answer any of those questions. And while you guys are steadily typing in your questions, let's get into the pre-submitted ones. So one of the ones we had was, what standards need to be adhered in order to qualify as something being accessible? And we did touch on this during the presentation, but can you give us a quick summary?
Sure. And it is a critical factor because a lot of folks, as I described earlier, think that there is a standard or can point me to what I have to do. And each organization needs to develop their standard on their own. They should be using the WCAG 2.1 success criteria and conformance metrics associated with that. They should be defining at a field by field level what their compliance target is, all right, whether it's single A, double A, or triple A, all right, and that should be identified for all of the different form objects that you can use inside either a fillable PDF or an online form or a printed document associated with it. There are white papers on our website that go through this in a bit more detail, and it is something that we can talk about with each of you on how we would do that. For some organizations where they have very complex scenarios, we've actually done full analysis and recommendations. We've looked at their forms, made an assessment, given them a statement of this is our recommendation of what your policy should look like. But ultimately, each organization must have a policy to which is their target and which they hit. That's the key to being able to demonstrate to either an individual, a lawyer, or a judge, this is how I met my accessibility guidelines.
Perfect. How might advancements in technology like AI impact the future of accessible forms?
Yeah, good question. There's a lot of conversation around that. And so the short answer is that AI today doesn't really affect anything that I talk about. But what we are seeing is potential for shifts in how people interact with web content and how they provide information to organizations. Fundamentally, a form is about capturing information and presenting information and creating a document of record. If I'm capturing information, right now your fillable PDFs or you're moving to an online capture like that screen that I showed where I can fill that information out and maybe I produce a PDF document, maybe I don't. Okay. AI is starting to lead us into natural language where instead of a series of fields, maybe I have a series of prompted questions that the AI guides me through and says, Eric, your full name is Eric Stevens. Is that correct? Yes. Your address is this. Is that still your address? Yes, it is. Is that both your billing and your shipping address? Yes, it is. Now we could see, because we're form professionals, we can see how I would do that in a form. Okay, it's an address block and a checkbox and a name block and all of those kinds of things. But AI is going to change that interaction. Now that's capturing data and putting it in. And it could be capturing data and putting it on that document so that at the end of it, it says, here is the form filled out. Please review it for its content and to ensure that all the information is correct. If it is, press the submit button and I'll send you an email so that you can digitally sign it and return it back to me, and then we'll process your application. That's where we see AI changing the way that people are interacting, not just with forms, but changing their interaction with organizations, changing their interaction with state departments, agencies, city governments, with banks, financial institutions, wealth management, healthcare. That's where we see the change. When's that coming? That's a great question. I'll have an answer for that, but probably sooner than I think.
Yeah, AI moves rather quickly. I'm surprised at how quickly the jumps have been.
Yeah.
We are getting close to the top of the hour. I do have a handful of questions. We will be staying late to make sure everybody's questions are answered, but I know people have other things that they need to do, and we want to be sensitive to that. So just make sure you do give us our questions. It will be part of the recording, and if you have to drop off before your question is answered, we'll make sure you get the response. But let's do a live audience one. Any guidance on signatures for forms in Canada? It's been mentioned that PDFs are not considered accessible.
PDFs are challenging and accessible, and they might be considered accessible depending on what you're doing. There are many organizations in Canada, financial institutions we've worked with to take their fillable PDF forms and make them accessible. It's a number of projects we've done for very large banks in Canada. And so we have made the PDF forms completely accessible. From a signature perspective, okay, we strongly advocate that all organizations review and implement a digital signature policy as soon as possible. Right now, physical signatures still tend to be the way that people go. And the challenge with physical signatures is we're getting more and more people who might have an online interface, a good interface, or even if it's a fillable PDF, they are still forced to print it, sign it, scan it, and email it back to you, okay? And there's a challenge in data capture. Once it's done that, you got to run OCR on it, you got to image it, all of those kinds of pieces. Now, organizations say, well, no, I need that because I need the signature on it. In all Western jurisdictions, Europe, US, Canada, okay, most Latin American and most Asian, some Middle East, digital signatures are considered equivalent to physical signatures for the purpose of evidentiary submissions, and digital signatures cannot be used to refute the validity of a document. In other words, digital signatures are equivalent to physical signatures on all normal operational correspondence you're going to deal with your citizens, with your constituents, with your customers. There are 3 cases where that is not true: wills, birth certificates, death certificates. If you're dealing with those, you're right. You need a physical signature. Everywhere else, you do not need it. Okay. Now, you can still do a physical signature. That's fine, but you're going through that scanning process. You're going through that submission process, and you're, as an organization, still dealing with the data capture process that you need to deal with. Versus online capture, insert it straight into your core systems, produce a PDF document that is the representation, send it for digital signature via email, receive it back, and attach it to the data record that is the core of what you've got as a proof of. Now, there is another piece, and we have white papers on digital signatures and all of those kind of pieces, and we can give you a lot of good recommendations, more than I can go into on here. That's another webinar unto itself. One of the ways that a lot of organizations are solving this is what's called ClickWrap. If I log into a portal, that portal has my username, my password, I was authenticated, and I went in and I filled out a piece of information, a submission, okay? I recently did this. I did a prepayment on my mortgage. I went in, I filled out an online form, web application, submitted it. Somebody off at the bank reviewed it and went, yep, everything's good. It was processed. No document was produced. No signature was required. Why? Because I logged in. Only I could have logged in. That is equivalent to a physical signature for the vast majority of interactions you're going to have with your users, with your customers, with your citizens.
So there's a follow-on question. Do you mean digitally drawn signatures or self-certified signatures?
So all of the above. A digitally drawn signature and a physical wet signature, okay, are equivalent. There is no way when somebody does a digitally drawn signature on a PDF and flattens the PDF and sends you an email of the scanned image of the PDF that you can tell the difference. Now, there are ways, okay, advanced image processing, but for the purposes of the signature, which is a statement of approval on this, it's equivalent. I do it all the time. I have a signature image. I go into Adobe Acrobat. I go put this signature there. I'm done. That is my acceptance of that document. That's a signature. Perfectly allowed and is legally equivalent to a wet signature and legally equivalent to in the case of a self-signed cert. Now, proper digital signature mechanisms, and the ones that we actually do recommend a more sophisticated digital signature environment, okay, for most organizations, especially those in healthcare, financial services, or government, it's not just a self-signed cert. It is a authenticated mechanism that is provided in a unique way by a third party, whether it's a Adobe Sign, whether it's DocuSign. Those kinds of products handle that and actually create a cert that is appropriate for that signing environment, and they stand by that. So that creates another level of security associated with it.
How can organizations ensure their forms are accessible on both desktop and mobile devices?
So the challenge is desktop versus mobile. Desktop means browser or Acrobat Reader for PDFs. The only way to really ensure that they're accessible on mobile is to move to an online interface. That's a key aspect of this. If you're just in a fillable PDF scenario, we can do a lot to make that form accessible, but the challenge is that it's still going to be a poor user experience on a mobile device, and that will limit accessibility. It's no good if there's help text, but the help text spans across the window and is cut off on a mobile device. So that's the real challenge. The best way to ensure accessible data capture experiences is to move them into that online interface that you saw, that good experience that gives you that what we call responsive, gives you a size adjustment. It knows how to display it inside of a smaller window. It displays the messages in a smaller window. Just as we reach the top of the hour, I just want to remind everybody of our offer, that if any of you are interested in understanding more, focusing on your organization and your specific needs, please reach out to Angel or myself, and we'd love to set up a meeting with you, have a one-on-one conversation, talk about what your situation is, help guide you through the identification of the next steps, help figure out how you can tackle these kinds of things.
Thanks for that reminder. And I only have two more questions. One, it looks like it was still a follow-up from that thread in the live stream that I missed. Their question was thoughts on Foxit versus Adobe, which I assume they're referring to different types of digital signatures.
No, Foxit versus Adobe. Foxit is a PDF reader environment. For purposes of this and filling things out, we really don't have an opinion on either one of those. The real opinion that we have, you should be moving away from fillable PDFs. That's really what you should be doing. So both of those should be reconsidered in light of an online experience, a truly online web experience. That is our direction to get to accessibility, to modernize what you're doing right now. That's the direction. But in terms of tool sets, you need to make that choice on it. They're really equivalent as far as we're concerned.
And so last chance for anyone in person to write their last question while I ask the last pre-submitted one. The last pre-submitted question was, what feedback mechanisms can be used to continuously improve form accessibility?
Oh, good question. So one of the things that we recommend is that inside your organization, even if it's an externally facing document, find the folks inside your organization who suffer from different disabilities and ask them to go through the experience. Ask them to go and download a change of address form. They'll tell you immediately. That's your best feedback mechanism, is to actually have a person with disabilities and have different disabilities. A hearing disability, a physical disability, a visual disability are all different experiences. Go through it with them. Run those tests, run that compliance analysis, ensure it meets it, but then go have a real user go through that experience and see what it's like to do it. What we find is that a lot of organizations didn't even know they had downloadable PDFs that were being filled out by people. And so they didn't even know that there was a bad user experience, never mind a non-accessible user experience. So you should be going in and going, what's it like for my users all the time? And you should find folks who can test it from that perspective for you, using their tools, like opening it up with the screen reader they use naturally, using the assistance tools that they use naturally, using the Windows setup for accessibility that they use naturally. That'll give you a really good assessment of where you are.